Someone had a question.
I'm not sure how to explain it, but you were talking about just receiving it.
Mm-hmm.
Can anybody receive it, or do you have to be more in a calm motion? Can you receive it even if you're crazy? And you got all these desires and all these emotions. Can you actually just sit down and say, Jesus Christ, just, I'm not sure if you...
Well, there's, Swamiji often comments that people declare themselves saved, but Jesus also has to agree. It's not enough for you to accept the Guru also has to accept you, because you have to be ready and capable of working with the Guru. So there's a lot of emotion in people's spiritual life. So common sense is the key here. The divine is always the same. And the masters are always emanating the same divine love and the same uplifting, liberating power. They never change. It's actually very interesting to really feel that. Nothing ever interferes with masters, with Jesus's or master, Babaji's. They just constantly emanate. They're a perfectly clear window. The sun is always shining through the perfect clarity of their window. We were all just standing outside and moving just to get exactly in the rays. The rays were just there. I mean, the sun wasn't choosing or not choosing us. We were adjusting ourselves to be just so in relation to the sunlight. And we were able to move around, and there were enough choices. We could all find the sun just where we wanted it. The vibrations, the transforming vibrations of the Gurus are always there. And it's up to us whether we notice, whether we're able to tell what it is, whether and what to tell the difference between just a pleasurable sensation, a subconscious idea, and a true, an emotional catharsis, and a true melding of our consciousness into the infinite ray. And it's not a question of, it comes in, going back to the concept of vibration, it comes into us exactly to the extent that we match it. So a person might have a demeanor that's really not clearly understandable, but they may have a very pure heart. Master talked about the disciple who was very spastic, couldn't talk, could hardly move, and Master said he's very close to liberation. Divine Mother is pleased with his devotion. And Swami said, well, sir, because Swami didn't know what else to say, he said, well, it must be a very simple kind of devotion, because the man had so little capacity to express. And Master said, that's what pleases God the most. So it's not about what it looks like, it's about what your actual purity of your heart is and who you actually are and what you're actually doing, and then whether or not you put yourself in the sunlight. So the first step is to put yourself in the sunlight, and the next step is to attune and harmonize yourself. That's why Master, for his disciples, always emphasized attunement. He emphasized it in private, Swami said. He talked about other things in public, but in private he always talked about attunement. And if you think of attunement as, two vibrations, I think of it like, you can think of it most clearly, I think, when you think of sound. Because if two people are singing the notes and they're in harmony with each other, the voices will come together. And if the voices are not quite in harmony with each other, you'll just hear one voice and you'll hear the other voice, and they'll be trying to sing the same song, but there's never that feeling of it blending together. When you hear really, really well done barbershop quartets, they have that amazing capacity to bring even very odd tunes, and they show off how they can stay in perfect sync no matter how complicated. But if one of those voices was a little off, it wouldn't go together properly. So that's exactly what it is, and I would think of it from the heart. If Divine Mother if Master, if Jesus is We're trying to lift our consciousness, but we're still holding on to the things we're afraid of. Make me a saint, but not yet. And so the sunlight's shining on us, but we have a lot of sunscreen on. So it's there, but it only comes through here because of all the sunscreen here. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So,
Uh-huh.
so in reality, you have to be able to calm your heart.
Yes, you do.
So if you have your heart agitated, it ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the heart is really where it all starts. Swamiji says people talk about calming the mind for meditation, but the mind responds to the heart. It's actually the heart you have to calm down. The mind is agitated if your feelings are agitated. If your feelings are calm, your mind is also calm. Yeah.
It wasn't a reflection from the meditation, but just the continuing or increasingly, what's the word? I'm starting to get this feeling of, if I were there, when we've had the opportunity to be next to great ones, how hard it is to be like the helper of Ma, who would just gather up the things from the top of the dresser and walk out the door, 100 feet behind her, to be so in tune with someone who on the surface seems so kind of, wow, that's crazy. Mm-hmm. And yet that's the challenge. Yeah. And that's really challenging, to realize that we're supposed to just be ready at a moment's notice to do whatever that person who truly is feeling God's flow, to be that willing to just drop everything and try to get into the wake of that flow. That's very challenging.
There's an interesting part of that. I have been in this little cycle of reading about Ananda Ma, and it's just been a little sort of, it's over now. I mean, I've sort of had a certain number of books and I just read them. And I learned a great deal. I also, I was doing it also just as an exercise in attunement with Swamiji, because he was very close to her. And so understanding her better, and everything you read about great souls, I always understand Swami more too. There's a very touching little exchange in this book about, there were a lot of these young women who because Ma became known so young in her life and lived into her 80s, people met her as children and then had their whole life with her. And because of the Indian way of the whole family comes, so if the mother and father get interested, all the children come, and so many people met Anandamoy when they were children, Anandamoy Ma when they were children, and she put out a lot of energy toward children. In fact, she had rules. This is her advice to children. Obey your parents, study as much as you're asked to, always tell the truth, and if you do those things, you can be a little naughty sometimes. And when the parents objected, she said, if they do those things, they won't have much chance to be naughty. But so there were some young girls who were like teenagers or a little older, and a few of them just joined Ma's ashram and joined her and just never left. And they had their whole lives, they didn't marry, they had their whole lives there. And one of them at one point, for some reason, Ma had scolded her or assigned a penance to her for something that she had to do. And she laughed and said to Ma, essentially, I'm not here to become spiritually liberated. I'm just here to enjoy your company. But the level of renunciation and of selflessness that was necessary to move in that world. But what she was actually saying is that this isn't tapasya. I never think of this as tapasya. This is the most enjoyable thing I can do with my life, because of the joy that's emanating from her, to just always be in her company and always feel that joy. And that's why Swamiji, when he starts trying to help us to understand who Jesus is, Jesus must have been extraordinarily joyful, because he was able to just say to people, "Follow me," and they did. And he was able to take them here and there, and he was able to put them in this enormous jeopardy in regard to the rest of the world. But many of them did not hesitate, because they were experiencing it. And so a lot of the pictures of Jesus are just completely wrong, and almost, I would say every, but maybe there's a film I haven't seen, almost every film of Jesus just completely misses the boat. You know, I saw one somewhere where I watched a fragment of it, and to do miracles, Jesus would sweat and strain, and then he would finally manage to push that water into wine, and then he would just be exhausted and have to take a nap. It was so crazy, because the only thing that could get people to do what they did for him was, it had to come right out of the heart. And it had to be joy, because joy is the one that moves you. Joy is our true nature. And when you have joy, nothing is difficult. You'll be in hell with the guru rather than be in heaven without him. Because if you're in hell, hell becomes heaven, because of the irrepressible joy. Just as simple as that. And that's what they all felt in Ma's company. It didn't mean anything to them, because there she was. There was so much joy in her company. And that's also when we're straining to receive. And this is why Jesus' life is such a fascinating story, and why the resurrection is so much more important than the crucifixion, except you can't get to one without the other, is that, yes, it's true that sometimes we have to slog through, drag through, struggle through really horrible experiences. It's what life is like. Life is just full of really terrible experiences. But on the other side of it always is this unmitigated joy. That's how Swami talked about, I was just watching a video of him saying this, when he had that dream of being burned at the stake. He said it was toward the end of his life, he had a dream one night that he was going to be burned at the stake, and the enemies, and it was just going to happen, and he talked about just being completely indifferent to the fact. He was neither elated nor depressed. And, it would hurt perhaps, but just for a little while, and then it would be over. And he was sort of being tied to the stake, and the fire was being set all around him. And he said, in the peculiar way of dreams, his enemies were just right next to him having a banquet. He was being burned at the stake. They were having dinner. He didn't identify his enemies. Maybe they weren't identified. But what difference did it make to him? Because the feeling of the divine and of God's presence was there just the same. This would be just a little wave on the surface, but the other part would be the same. And then in the dream, he said, his friends broke in and rescued him. So in fact, he wasn't burned at the stake, but he himself was gratified to see that his response to being rescued was the same as his response to being burned. Which was, well, if this is what's going to happen, that's fine. He told that story quite a few times. It's quite amazing to contemplate. But that's not because he was dulled down. It was because he was in a state of bliss all the time. Swami was telling us this story during those last years, when he just talked about being in a state of bliss all the time. And so Jesus was there being crucified, there being scourged, there with the crown of thorns, humiliated, spat upon, all those awful things that happened to him, dragging the cross. When we moved in here, the 14 stations of the cross were on the walls, and we took them down. We didn't want them in any case. I actually, at one point, studied that and did a little class on it, but just every agonizing step of his terrible experience on the way to being crucified. On one hand, it's really important to realize that, because otherwise we begin to think of our spiritual life as a bargain with God, that now that I'm your devotee, you're going to make it all smooth for me, aren't you? And when we don't get what we want, we question whether God really loves us. we've made our relationship with Him conditional on Him providing for us that which we think should be provided. So this whole story of Christ in which, the most beloved Son of God actually still has to go through all these experiences, it's a very subtle story. Because in fact, it did happen. And it was as horrific as they describe. And now, well, I should say unfortunately, I was going to say thanks to, but because of all these movies, where they just, when I ever see even bits of them, you can't watch them at all, not for a second. It's not that they're just so horrific, it's one thing to imagine in your mind, it's another to have it acted out on a screen. But because the look in the eyes of Jesus is so un-Christ-like, they just haven't any idea how to put it forth. And so you can't imagine why anyone would follow this man. So you have to really go into your heart and ask, he must have been. And that's why Swami talks about how just completely wonderful Master was as a person. How completely entertaining and humorous and loving. And we all know what Swami was like. He could just make anything fun. Even in the midst, I've made references to our particular little trials. Even in the midst of that, we would leave the courtroom and go to lunch and just laugh all through lunch. And we get back in the car and drive home and laugh all through dinner. And it was a horrible experience. But it was like, so, it's a horrible experience. It doesn't mean, and this is what I said right at the beginning, one will be fearless and joyful in your heart if you're going to be. It doesn't really. It's not created from the outside. It's very powerful. And so Jesus' experience, this is the part that is not yet understood. This is the Dwapara Yuga part that's going to have to come up somehow. Although maybe we'll just start talking more about the resurrection than the crucifixion. I remember walking through the Uffizi in Florence, the art museum in Florence with Swamiji, and we looked at a lot of religious art, and a lot of it was about the suffering of Christ. And we came out and Swami just said so simply, "Time for a new theme," he said. We've taken that one about as far as we can take it. So on one hand, maybe it's just time for a new theme. But I don't think so really, because crucifixion is part of life, and crucifixion is part of spiritual life. And if we're not prepared, as Jesus himself said, to pick up our cross and follow him, we'll find that we won't be able to succeed. Because if we're not tested, we never get strong. And somehow we have to be tested, or else those little meannesses of the heart just hang out in there and make it impossible to receive. Does that make sense? Any thoughts or questions, Stephen?
It's interesting because so many of the followers of Christ, whether direct disciples or not, gave up their own lives.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, to what extent was that attunement with that particular vibration? Was it necessary? Because it continues into modern times. There are many Christians who are currently being martyred.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, this is going on for 2,000 years. You don't hear of Ramakrishna's disciples being killed, Yogananda's disciples
Although
being killed.
the Tibetan Buddhists were also martyred.
Yeah.
In recent times. The Jews were martyred in recent times.
Yeah.
But yes, there is a certain truth, as things begin, so they continue. But Swami said that also in terms of the teachings of Christ being betrayed. To be willing to die for your faith, let me think about this for a minute. Swamiji said that the persecution of the Christians was necessary because it dramatically proved the power of the teachings. It got people's attention. That this was so powerful in people's lives that they would rather face death than give it up. And it had tremendous magnetism because people had to stop and think, what could be that powerful that people would throw their lives away? And it was also genuinely a certain tapasya. For anything to be manifested in this world, the energy has to be drawn from somewhere. And that was spoken about Swamiji when he took so much through his body, and he had those arthritic hips for 20 years, and he only had them replaced when Ananda was well established. And it was like the tapasya was necessary somehow for the founding of the community. How exactly you would work that out metaphysically, I'm not exactly sure, except that, and if you think just in a very common sense way, if you want to be an Olympic athlete, the tapasya you do, the sacrifice you make, is that you don't get to live an ordinary life. Those little young girls who are being ice skaters, they go to the ice skating rink early in the morning, they spend the afternoon there. Narani at Ananda Village was very serious about gymnastics all through high school. And so you just talked to her. She just never had anything remotely resembling. She loved doing it, but everything else was put aside for this one pointed concentration. And you can say it's practical that she had to train her body, but also there was a more subtle force going, that this is why they win, is because they're willing to do everything that's necessary to win, and a certain power is generated by that concentration. And I think when Jesus' teachings, which were not there, I mean, he was a figure who rose up, was humiliated, and was executed, and everyone thought that was going to be the end of it. And yeah, there was this rumor that he'd risen and so on, but there were this many people who thought it was true. But those very people then took that message, and it became for them, and this is, again, it's fascinating to think about, it became for them their only priority. And they just went out and started delivering that message. And when they went to the synagogues, and after a time, most of the traditional Jews kicked them out, didn't want to hear it anymore, then they went to the Gentiles. But it was what they were born to do. They had been given this mission, they had had this experience, they had perceived this truth, and everybody around them was suffering. And if they could receive that truth, then their suffering could stop. And they absolutely could not stop. They could do nothing except to follow through on that call. And if it meant impoverishment, persecution, imprisonment, or death, again, imagine what that feels like. It's not that hard to imagine what that feels like, because we're living very close to that same reality. We haven't been asked to die, or be imprisoned, or be tortured, and I hope we don't. I'm not eager about it, but in modern times, people have.
You know, there was a movie that I saw within the last couple of years, a more contemporary movie of the life of St. Peter with Omar Sharif that I thought was beautifully done, that gave me an appreciation for that idea. I didn't know so much about it, but when it was time for him to give up his life, you know, he was in communion with Christ, and he gave himself so willingly. And, you know, in the movie anyway, Jesus came to him and said, "Peter, it's time.
Right.
And this is what's going to happen, and I'll walk through it with you."
Right. And once again, if Jesus comes and says, "Come, give me your hand, we're going to walk through this together," why would you not say yes to that, no matter what it looks like? And you're right, Christianity has that martyr element to it, and it's just always been a huge part of it. Stephen, the first martyr, was the first one to be stoned to death for his faith. And he's greatly revered because and then at the end, he said, "Oh, Lord, there you are." And he was lifted up into the light. Master said specifically, if you die a martyr's death, you don't suffer. If you hold to the faith to the end, you don't suffer. You appear to suffer, but you don't suffer. And that's the big secret of the whole thing, is that from our side, we can only imagine deep identification with the ego and the body, but from the devotee's side, you're so identified with God. If this is what He's giving to you, that's what you take.
You know, it's an interesting path for those who choose to go very deeply into it. And it attracts perhaps a certain type of individual who's willing, those who are willing to go to that depth.
Well, I think been there, done that also applies to us. I can't imagine that we haven't been martyred for our faith. And if we haven't yet, I'm sure we'll have to be. Because anything you fear is karma that you haven't yet finished. And that you have to, if you're going to realize God, it has to be the only thing you want. So that obviously leads to giving up your life for it in one form or another. I mean, I'm not really saying that from Swami told me, which I can say for some things, but common sense says it has to be true. We must be tested on these things repeatedly, or how would we know? However, whereas in the past, suffering and the sorrow was the coin of man's redemption, for us now that payment has been exchanged for calm acceptance and joy. It's Dwapara Yuga ascending, and we may not have to do that stuff anymore. But the mere fact that we really hope that we don't has something to say about... I mean, I worry about these things because I'm... worry is perhaps... I think about these things because I'm a very front of the parade kind of person. I'm a very public figure. I don't mean I worry about it in this present incarnation, but I've been working this whole incarnation to be 100%. And so what are my limits on this? If I am 100%, I wrote that letter from Tiruvannamalam, I can never say it properly, darn it, where Ramana Maharshi's ashram is, about Ramana Maharshi walking out of his home when he was 16 years old. He was living an ordinary life as a student with his family, and he somehow, the realization came to him that truly the only purpose of life was God. Oh, he had a death experience. He felt like he had died. He felt like he had died, and when he came out of it, he realized, so what am I doing going to school and doing all this? The only thing that matters is that I overcome all of these limitations. That's all that's really happening here. So he walked out of his house and he never went back. Eventually his family found him and his mother came to live with him, as often happens with these saints. But he walked out of his house at the age of 16 with nothing. He went to some local temple, just sat down and started meditating. Eventually sort of went underground into some tiny little room and just started meditating. Rats, mice, bugs, very little food, just barely sustaining himself. And gradually they found him, and India being what it is, people started taking care of him. One thing led to another, and eventually he became a very well-known sadhu, lived in this cave and that cave, and they built an ashram for him, and all these different things. He remained very similar to that. He did not talk a lot. He was mostly in a state of meditation. And so then I was thinking, because of his story and because of the power, we sat and meditated in a couple of the caves where he meditated. I mean, there's this mountain which is said to be the manifestation of Lord Shiva. And so we walked halfway up this mountain and we went into this cave, which is the first cave he meditated in. And a cave in India kind of gets built out a little bit. They'll kind of build an entryway and a room, and so they'll build onto the cave in a sense. So after we walked out, I looked at it from the outside. It was this, humongous granite boulder, which had just been an overhang like this. So of course, when he first found it, he just crawled under the rock, and there was a room formed by the rock. And the rock was, to sit under that rock, which I had just been sitting, it was a little disconcerting. It was so powerful. But he was able to do that. No concern about food, water, sustenance of any kind, heat, cold, nothing. And then, not too much later, I'm talking in a comfortable Bangalore apartment, a nice flat in the Diamond District of Bangalore, which is a very classy district. And we're talking about my meeting Swamiji and my just leaving everything, going to Ananda Village. This woman looks at me and, weren't you worried? No, it never crossed my mind to be worried. Never once has it crossed my mind to be worried. All of a sudden I thought, oh, I couldn't walk out of my house and go sit in the basement of a temple without, taking a little backpack and lunch. And by dinner I'd be looking for a place to eat. Just out of the question. But I left the university in San Francisco and went to live with Swami, and never once crossed my mind that that was something to worry about. And yet this woman, listening to me, thought, wow, look at that. And I just realized we have to be at the front of our own story, and we have to be pushing against the ice, so to speak. We have to be icebreakers, all of us. We have to be standing there pushing against whatever's holding us back. And it doesn't matter what that looks like in relationship to anybody else's reality. It just needs to be the front edge of our reality. I'll tell you a story that you may have heard, but it's worth repeating. When Swamiji was visiting us once for a longer visit, long enough that we had a sevaka and a sadhaka satsang, and the sevakas are the lay order, so to speak, and the sadhakas are the lay order, people who live not in community but have their own lives but are still very devoted to the path, have karmic responsibilities, is how we phrase it, that mean they don't live in community and they're not subject to orders, so to speak. And the sevakas are those who don't have any other karmic responsibilities and can do whatever is asked of them. So he gave the sadhaka satsang, and on the way over he asked me, what should I talk about? I said, sir, everybody's always trying to understand what it means to be a sadhaka because it's not clear-cut in anybody's mind. Why don't you talk about what it means to be a sadhaka? So he sits down and he starts talking about renunciation. And he starts talking about the level of his own renunciation. And he's telling many stories about just how nothing mattered to him but God, just so completely, without reservation. And then he talks about being thrown out of SRF in 1962, having to go back and live with his parents, his life gradually starting. He was using his parents' car, and his father said to him, well, since you're using the car all the time, I'd like to give it to you and just put it in your name. Swami, telling the story, begins to cry. He said, I cannot tell you how painful it was for me to have to accept ownership of that car. He said, I had renounced everything for God, and now I had to own a car. And he said, I know it's going to be hard for you to understand, but he's crying while he tells us, to realize that this is what had happened to his life, that now he had to own a car. So that is that. So then he finishes, whatever, and then he turns to me and he says, Asha, is there anything more I should say? I said, because I am not that attuned to his Kayal, I said, well, maybe you should tell people about the sadhaka order. He looks just like this. I've been talking about nothing else. And then he looks at this group and he says, don't even think about living the way I live, and certainly don't try. He said you could never do it, and it would not be at all appropriate for you. I mean, he was nothing if not original. I mean, in the way because, see, what he was trying to do is he was trying to get people to understand what real renunciation is, and therefore to understand my own reality in relation to that. Instead of describing their reality, he described their potential. And the challenge then was for people to have the inner strength to just see themselves honestly and be able to move forward from there. Instead of always imagining, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? Why am I not accepted? You don't really love me. If you really loved me, you would do this. No, just look at yourself. Do we weep when we can't get the car? It never crosses our mind to cry because we have to own one. I mean, so going back to martyrdom and so on like that. It's like, yes, there is that quality of suffering in Christianity, and I don't like it much. And we have the comfort of that line in the Festival of Light that it's not even the point. But if suffering comes, then this tells us, well, true Christianity tells us how to deal with it. Orthodox Christianity doesn't. Yeah.
I hosted a showing of the Joan of Arc movie that a year ago by that Ingrid Bergman was in, the black and white, and I was telling everybody who had come to watch it. Now really pay attention to the last scene, because this last scene really shows a Christian understanding it from, or acting as if they're living in a Dwapara understanding of what it is to accept tapasya for.
Because she just ascended rather than suffered?
And what the surprise to me was
Uh-huh.
that the version that we ended up seeing that night wasn't exactly the version I'd seen before. There were two cuts of this
I
movie.
see.
One of them had it the way that Swami and Master would have died in martyrdom, and the other one had it more like the Temptation of Christ kind of scene.
Really?
And both of them seem to be out there in the public.
Really?
And
How
so you
interesting.
could choose your ending.
So the directors had a choice.
Wow.
But it's...
And one is the traditional martyrdom, oh my God, and one is being above all suffering,
I mean,
because of the contemplation of joy.
but it is interesting, and I think people would take lives of martyrdom, Peter and all those other disciples too, because that is their opportunity. Okay, let's go right back. Ramana Maharshi could just walk out of his house and sit under the temple. I could drive away from San Francisco and go live in a tent. And it never crossed my mind that it was difficult. Some of you have given up certain situations and moved into the Ananda community in very similar ways to what I have done. And there would be a point where you just walk out of your body, where it's just like the opportunity to die is no different than the opportunity to move to Ananda village. I mean, truthfully, that would be what it would be. And we in our own hearts, okay, let me think about this, because see, this is the point of Easter, is not that we tense ourselves up and get ready for the tough times. Boy, as soon as you take Kriya initiation, your karma is really going to come up and it's going to be hard for you. No wonder your life fell apart. I mean, I just can't stand it when people say that sort of thing. But there is truth in it. We have to be ready for the fact that once we make this bargain with God, He is going to take charge of our lives, and He is going to start running the story according to the true agenda. And the true agenda is divine freedom and perfect bliss. It's not, how long can I postpone having to deal with all these things that bind me and just have another pleasant round or two. I mean, a lot of us in our minds, even whether we're admitting it or not, that's really how we're functioning this. You know, yes, of course I want you, but this time I'd also like to have, and this, and then maybe that, and then we try to just make it all work together, which is okay. That's why Swami said, don't even think about trying to live like I am. Because you're not drawn to it. It's not your karma. But then we should courageously just stand back and think, well, I have this little plaque from the Joan of Arc play that we just did with the school that one of the mothers made. It's a beautiful picture of Joan on it, and it says, I am not afraid. I was born to do this. And it's a direct quote from her. When I saw that, I said, oh my gosh. And the lady just handed it to me, bless her, and I keep it right on my counter. I mean, I'm trying to write a book about Swami, and I'm kind of nervous about it right now. I am not afraid. I was born to do this. If you were born to it, it doesn't look the same to you. You're just arriving at the moment that you were born. Jesus says, for this, spare me from this hour, Lord, but for this hour was I born. Jyotish gave a sermon once in which he said, every one of us can stand up and declare that. That is the most creepy thing I ever think about. You know, here I am at Starbucks having a pumpkin latte. For this hour was I born. But the truth of the matter is, you were. Every moment is the summation of all your incarnations. Everything in all of creation has been conspiring to bring you right to this spot, because this is your chance to think about God or not. And so even as we contemplate what seems horrific to us, we have to realize that if it's happening, they were born for it. And we need to be cutting the ice of our own limitations and not be afraid of whatever's coming to us. Whatever is happening to us, for this hour was I born. I'm not afraid, I was born to do this. And Peter was born to die that way, and he knew it. And he may have felt the weakness of the flesh, because even Jesus felt the weakness of the flesh, which is to say, we are in a human body and we do, and if we're not self-realized, those struggles are more intense. But nonetheless, if God is with us and we're going forward, and we face that fear, imagine, Swamiji's ability to just calmly accept that he was going to be burned at the stake, it was just a dream, but it was reflective of his consciousness, was because he's been burned at the stake and he knows it's not such a big deal. It sounds funny to say that, but I'm sure we've all been martyred many times. And maybe it just really isn't such a big deal. It just seems like it is from the outside until we're born to do it. And that's a movable template that can be just laid over anything, whatever might come to us. For this hour was I born. I'm not afraid. I was born for this. Just whatever it is, whether it's sickness or health or heartbreak or difficulties with the people in your life, or just the sheer disappointment that all the fancy plans for yourself just look like they're not going to happen, which, just accepting that this is it. I had to, in various stages of my life when I really thought none of it was going to work out, I practiced my life review. I practiced, just sitting across from Master and showing him that the list was a little small. And it wasn't even the thought that I would die young. It was just that it just didn't look to me like it was ever going to come together, because it just wasn't. But I realized that the fear of it not coming together was a bigger karma than whether or not it ever came together. Does that make sense? That what was really what was really holding God at a distance was my self-preoccupation and all the fear in my heart. And that what I actually did or didn't do was far less important to him than the fear that I was carrying. Does that make sense? So that's why the story of Jesus, of just, they're coming to get him, they're about to crucify him. Pilate says to him, I love that part, Jesus is just there, and Pilate says to him, don't you understand? What's wrong with you, man? I could kill you or I could save you. Help me here. And Pilate's trying to get Jesus to help him, because Pilate does not want to crucify this man. There's the other part of this where his wife has had a dream. His wife sends him a message at the office. Have nothing to do with this man. Do not, under any circumstances, be responsible for his death. So he's got that sort of in the back of his mind, as his wife's going to be real upset with him if this goes wrong. But also the fact that she feels that way, and he can tell that there's something going on here that he doesn't. That's why he washes his hands of it. He tries so hard. And he's trying to get Jesus to relate on the level that Pilate lives. Pilate senses that Jesus is living on another level, but he doesn't know. He can't go there. He just literally can't go there. He doesn't have anything that's going to... Well, he has a fragment enough to get the point, but not enough to really go there. He wants Jesus to help him, save him. Jesus is just not at all interested. Pilate says, don't you understand I have power over life or death? Jesus answers, you would have no power over me except that my Father in heaven gave it to you. What's Pilate supposed to do with that? He just doesn't know. So he goes back out to the crowd and hopes that they'll help him, because the crowd out there could also have rescued Pilate and Jesus from this execution, but they chose not to. Yes? Uh-huh.
When David was reading that passage last night, that particular passage, there was a line I hadn't heard before, that therefore, in essence, the karma was on those who turned Jesus over and not on Pilate. So what was that about?
Well, what David was reading was a combination of different gospels. So that is one of the things that the gospels say, which is he was the Messiah to his own people, and his own people turned on him because the power. I mean, when you read various out of the gospel accounts of these from psychics and mystics and saints and so on, it was orchestrated. The powerful people got a lot of rabble in there. And Catherine Emmerich talks about it, there's a lot of drunken rabble there that's being prodded by the priests who want this man killed to shout down the people who are trying to save him. And that it was put together. And yeah, that was a really bad thing, and the curse of doing it does fall on them. I mean, and I'm a Jewish person, and so are you, so we know what dicey turf we're walking when we start talking about this. But that was like not the smartest moment. That wasn't the brightest moment in Jewish history, when the Messiah was there and they crucified him. Kind of a bad decision. Swamiji actually takes it on. I think it's in the book, The Revelation of Christ. He talks about, let's go back, just because once you ever touch this subject, you have to be real careful. There is group karma. We look at the world, and Germans have characteristics, and Norwegians have characteristics, and men from Minnesota have certain characteristics, right? Jews have certain characteristics and karmas. But it's like the soul between incarnations stands above, excuse me. If you die a German, you don't go to the German astral world. And when you're ready to reincarnate, it's not like you only have a German passport and therefore you have to go back to Germany. The soul stands completely outside of these things. And each of those cultural, national, ethnic, historical situations, it has its own karma that's going to continue to play itself out. And the soul decides whether or not it is karmically appropriate for you to participate in that destiny. So the Jewish people have a destiny, and they have certain inculcated attitudes based upon their interesting and colorful history. But it's not like individual souls are continually being punished as Jews. It's just that if you need to work with that particular vibration, you'll enter there. And so Swami writes in Revelations of Christ about how the attitudes of power, position, pride, intellectuality, rationality, lack of attunement caused a lot of people in the time of Jesus to make the wrong choice, and still causes a lot of people who are incarnated as Jews to make the wrong choices. And that the karma of that group is not going to resolve until they recognize the reality. Because now Judaism is so firmly against even the possibility of a realized soul. There's no self-realization at all in Judaism. And there's no possibility of a guru in Judaism. It's just absolutely verboten. And how can you ever grow if you don't have those things? So you just kind of wander around being Jewish. I had a rabbi come to me who said when he tried to teach Sunday school, he realized that he didn't know what to say. He didn't know what Judaism was. And I told him that neither do I. I'll tell you what Sanatana Dharma is and see if we can find any of it in modern Judaism. Not very much. And he later stopped being a rabbi. I mean, I wasn't trying to break his faith, but it was the truth. And so where did we start on that? How did we get there? Yeah, it was bad karma. And a few years later, the temple was destroyed and they were dispersed. They lost their home. And, a bad move on their part, and it set in motion collective karma. It was a corrupt priesthood. The vocabulary I work with is a corrupt priesthood, because it doesn't matter what the name of the religion is. They're not the religion, they're a corrupt priesthood. And a corrupt priesthood turned aside the light, because the light of heaven is greater than the light of the world, and they were attached to the world. And that was bad karma. That acted itself out. Jews lost their homeland for a really, really long time. And the Bible says it. A lot of people a lot of bullies and sadists have used those facts in the Bible to do things that haven't helped them very much, that has set in motion a lot of bad karma for them. But you have to stand back. Either God is in charge or He's not. And if He's ever in charge, He's always in charge. This is the big challenge. Okay, any thoughts or comments or questions? We can go back to biblical times here. Yeah? Yes?
And of course,
Can you pass that across? Uh-huh. Sorry.
and of course, it isn't just that the Jews of that time had a corrupt priesthood. Most great spiritual movements, I'm trying to think of one that hasn't, have ended up with something akin to a corrupt priesthood that got completely off track from the original wonderful impetus that caused that religion to become great in the first place.
Well, see, and this is the irony of the whole thing. The Jewish people of that time, let's go back to biblical times now, and see, this is the interesting addition of the legend of the Essenes, the story of the Essenes. People recognize the Essenes were there, and it seems to be that Jesus was part of the Essene community. It seemed to be that the Essenes knew the Messiah was coming, that they prepared for him. And there's just so much in the Bible that isn't in the Bible, so much in the times that isn't in the Bible, that there was sufficient devotion and receptivity to draw a Messiah. I mean, now that's really quite something. They drew an incarnation, and there was enough spiritual depth and power there that an avatar came to save them. And that was where Jesus was heartbroken. And he wept. He wept for Jerusalem. I came to save you. I came to restore your greatness, and you've turned your back on me. Of course, not everyone, but in the end, oddly, they all did, because even afterwards, I've been reading the Acts of the Apostles, and they went out, and Jesus' teachings was Judaism. That's the irony of the whole thing. It was Judaism beginning, middle, and end. Virtually all his disciples were Jews. They followed the Jewish law, or they participated in the Jewish world, because everything else around them was pagan. That's what I was saying. They all had all these different gods who had all these different powers, and you had to propitiate this one. And it was not uplifted. It was not Sanatana Dharma. It was just trying to get what you wanted by pleasing all these lower entities. There was no Sanatana Dharma. Judaism was the only one who understood the true teaching, which included reincarnation and self-realization and all of that. And he came to revitalize it. But this is where Swami's writing. They refused to allow themselves to be revitalized. Even after Jesus died and those disciples were going around, and they were proving with the Jewish scriptures that Jesus had been predicted, and much of that is in there. The prophets predicted this. But collectively, in the end, the synagogues closed against them and marginalized them. And then Paul went out and just started looking for a new story. So and then it became what it became, which is a whole new thing. So now, let me find the thread of this. We're in exactly that same situation. Do you know where we're sitting? We're sitting in a former Catholic church. And do you know why we were able to buy this church? Because they don't have enough priests. They didn't have enough priests to sustain their parishes. So self-realization came in and took the building from the Catholics. If you go to Assisi, There's a Catholic church there that is referred to as the Minerva Temple, right? Because the old gods were dying, and the Catholics took the Minerva Temple and made it into one of their churches. And there's this constant sort of ever-renewing reality. Now, that was the spirit of the disciples. They knew that this was a progression. When they asked Jesus who he was, he said, I came to fulfill your law. I didn't come to destroy your law, I came to fulfill it. And interestingly, when I was reading in the Acts of the Apostles, a lot of what they did, and they became, the disciples, they became very educated in the scriptures, and they would go into the synagogues and they would argue with other scriptural scholars to try to prove that this was in fact, it was right there in your scriptures. So there were many levels at which they tried to persuade people that this was a valid continuation of what they already believed. Now I'll say something else ironic. What are we doing right here? I'm trying to explain how Master's descent and self-realization is a valid continuation of Christianity. Isn't that? And I'm
The culmination of it.
and I'm quoting the scripture to tell you. I mean, it all seems so far away, but this is Peter sitting in a synagogue in some city in that world, quoting from their own scriptures, and of course that's only part of it, because what Peter was also, and Paul and all of them, what they were actually putting across was the good news. And what they were mostly putting across was the joy of it. And when you read the letters of Paul, which are a bit, there's a lot of words. He could have used less words, but he was writing with a pen, and that's how you do it. He was talking about how they were burdened by these endless laws that they had to meet. There was no grace, there was no love, there was no forgiveness in it. That's what Judaism had become. It had become the law of Moses, a legalistic system implemented by the priests. And so the individual was always a little bit at sea, trying to figure out how to do it right, because it was all just a system. And Jesus came in and he said, your Father loves you. We are children of God, and your Father will take care of you. And then it was added on that I am the way, and I will redeem you. And then it became Jesus died for our sins, and now we are no longer subject to the law of Moses. See, this became a huge controversy when Paul went out and started converting non-Jews. And you read in the Bible these incredible debates about whether you have to be circumcised to be saved. In the book, the Ask Asha book, which isn't yet available to everyone, there's a long chapter in that, because someone wrote me trying to say, what is the symbolic meaning of circumcision? So I noodled around a bit, and it was pretty far-fetched. I said, there isn't actually any. It was really a question of whether you had to be circumcised, men, because the question was, if you accept Christ, do you then have to follow the law of Moses also? In other words, do you have to convert to being a Jew? And circumcision was the big mark. That's how you could tell who was a Jew and who wasn't at that time. Of course, everything has changed now, so it doesn't make any sense at all. But it was a huge issue, because if Jesus is the fulfillment of this law, does everything in the past have to go with us? Or do we get to start a new reality? And Paul argued that no, you don't have to become a Jew. Jesus said salvation for all. And eventually what happened, happened. Now, here we are in exactly the same situation. People are coming into self-realization, bringing all of this, and Jewish people freak out when they say Jesus there. There's a story, Diksha, who's a devoted disciple at Ananda Village. She came into Master's work from here, from Palo Alto, this is in the Miracles and Answered Prayers book. She borrowed a car and it had a tape of me in it. And she turned on the recorder and heard me talking and really, really liked what I was saying. Somehow in there, she came to Ananda. It wasn't here, we were over on California Avenue, and she walked in and saw the picture of Jesus. She wasn't not only Jewish, she's from Israel. She saw the picture of Jesus up there. She says, it's hard to explain to people who aren't Jewish how impossible it was for me to stay in that room. So I don't know whether it was before or after, it slips my mind. She heard me speaking, really liked what I had to say. She was really seeking. So she started sneaking into Art Center to borrow tapes and then would sneak out. And somehow that was okay. And finally she was able to bring herself to a Sunday service. And when she came through the line where David and I were standing, she just blurted out in this incredible agitated state, "I'm Jewish." I said, "So am I, and so is David." And she just didn't know what to do with that. It was not the answer she expected. And the rest is history. But we bring into this is what I've been told I have to do in order to be pleasing to God. And it's not different than when Paul was saying, no, this changes that. Now it's different. You don't have to go to Mass every day. You don't have to have these rituals. In India, you don't have to pay the priest to do this. You don't have to do these pujas. It's a new dispensation. It's a new expression. It's a new reality. And there's great freedom in this. It's exactly the same situation. And our challenge is twofold. One is to be willing, let me think how to say it. Self-realization has never embraced the same evangelical spirit. Christians are motivated to try to convert because of this fascinating dogma that since the only way to God is through Jesus, everybody else is going to go to hell. And out of loving concern for everybody in the world, you have to try to tell them about Jesus so they won't go to hell. Savitri, who grew up in that kind of family, her mother was anxious from the day she was born that she accept Jesus Christ, because if she didn't, she would have to go to hell, and her mother would be in heaven, and she would go to hell. So as Savitri put it, when she was 10, she finally caved to the pressure, and she accepted Jesus Christ as her only Lord and Savior, and she describes kneeling at the altar rail. She's from Memphis, and she said inwardly, "Jesus, I have no quarrel with you, but I just want you to know I'm only doing this to get my mother off my back." It was that important. At the same time, in the early writings of Master, he exhorts people, keep copies of Autobiography of a Yogi with you at all times and pass them out to any receptive souls. Make it your goal to give away 25 copies of Autobiography every single month. And he was not casual about it. It's the nature of joy to want to share itself. And if we actually really believe in this teaching, what would we do? What should we do? Where is the prow of the ship? Where are we cutting through the ice? What is appropriate for each one of us? No, don't try to live like Swami Kriyananda. It's not appropriate. But what is appropriate? And then what's the implications of that? That's our own little relationship to this whole story. Because the parallels are exact. It's our leader hasn't been crucified and hasn't resurrected. I mean, it's not the same drama because it's not Dwapara Yuga, but it's the same story. Interesting. So even those Jews who crucified Jesus had very good karma because there they were with him. They were like Ravana. Ravana was the great enemy of Ram, but because he hated Ram so much, he was always thinking about him. I don't really know how true that is, but it's a marvelous twist on the story, isn't it? They try to say that Ravana was himself a great soul and chose to be the evil one because then his life would be totally obsessed with the Lord. Well, okay, where shall we go from here? thoughts or questions or... Yes, Stephen.
So in the context then of that karma of a group that draws the master, the avatar,
Right.
in this country it was a little different. Master was drawn here by the aspirations of, let's say, Christian yogis primarily, but there was a much broader picture too because of the nature of the creation of this country and the fertile soil for self-realization to be spread to the West.
Well, Master was drawn... Okay, Jesus appeared to Babaji, and it was to restore the original teachings of Jesus, but that doesn't really mean that he was drawn to the Christians. When Swami wrote the oratorio, and we went through that little cycle where we were going out incognito with no mention of Ananda or Swami Kriyananda, just to present that music to try to persuade the churches to accept it. And it was this, I would call it exercise in futility that we carried out for a while. And I, being such a practical person and not always being in tune, was one of those who was just curmudgeonly off on the side. This is never going to work. This is just so silly. This is never going to work. And of course, when it was clearly not going to work, we were with Swami and Carmel, as it happened when we had the conversation. Oh, he said, I knew it wouldn't work, but at least we had to try. And then he said, they have so much good real estate. If we could just convert them, just think how dynamic this could be. And he also said, if we could just convert them, if we could just wake them up to it. But seriously, he was joking when he said that, but he was also saying, it was really the exact equivalent of Paul going to all the synagogues and letting them reject it before he could feel that he could turn his back on it. So Swamiji thought he finally had an avenue into reaching. Swamiji was always trying to reach people who weren't interested in being reached. So much of what he did, he wrote under the name of Donald Walters and wrote God is for Everyone and Out of the Labyrinth and Hope for a Better World. These are all books that are really trying hard to reach people who are not already oriented. And so his taking the oratorio out into the churches, pretending it didn't come from a yoga group, was a serious attempt to awaken people to this inner reality in the hope that he could revitalize that. So it was his duty. He felt it was his duty to try because there it was. But Master, Master in a sense, let me just think for a second. Well, Babaji said, I see potential saints in Europe and America waiting to be awakened. So it wasn't actually identified as only, but it was the West. I would say he came for the West. That was what I was trying to say. He came for the West, and he came to America because of the deep longing of Americans for a practical spiritual path. That was what brought him. He really came for us first, really for Americans first, and then for all of Dwapara Yuga after that. And when Master was sitting there in the storage room and he saw all those faces going in front of him, well, he saw thousands of faces and he recognized them as Americans. I mean, I just think that's so much fun. He really is ours. And it's not so much, his work is the American spirit. His work is the American spirit. The anybody can do it, the caste and creed don't matter, the it's all in your hands, you can make your own spiritual destiny. And only in America could it start. Because even though Christianity has a certain hold, it doesn't have that much of a hold. He could break it easily enough. Although Swami Master did say that if persecution comes, he actually mentioned the Catholics will be the ones to persecute this work. Beware of the Catholics was what he actually said. Yeah, because that's the most powerful entrenched. But they haven't seen us as anything resembling a threat. They don't even know we're here yet. So we'll see. I mean, that was just a comment he made. I don't know whether it'll come true or not. All right. If there's no other thoughts, let's take a little bit of chant, a little bit of meditation, and then we'll finish up. Okay, go ahead, Saranya. Pass it over to her.
I don't know if it's actually a question or just a comment, but when we get into Easter and also Christmas time, when we go through the Bible stories, and it always, very often, feels a little uncomfortable to me because there are parts of the Bible that, I have a Christian background, but I don't interpret in the same way. I'm so much more comfortable with the way that self-realization interprets all of the universe, the things that happen to us. And I guess the part that feels uncomfortable is sometimes I wonder if we take the Bible and try hard to make it fit, when sometimes I'm just as happy letting go of some of the things that don't quite make sense, you know.
Oh, there's a lot of the Bible that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, huge parts. I just read it and I just think, thank God I don't have to try to understand this. I'm so grateful not to have to try to understand it. It's so obscure. I mean, there's a parable where that Jesus tells where he leaves money for people, and some of them develop it and some of them don't, and the ones who didn't do the proper thing, he just had them killed. I mean, it wasn't Jesus doing it, it was a parable, but it's just so brutal. And maybe it has a definition. I'm just really happy not to have to think about it. Because Jesus had to speak in images because of the times he lived in, and Master didn't. So whenever Master interprets the Bible, and Swami has interpreted the Bible, they don't interpret all of it. And they emphasize, in fact, of all the 4 Gospels, they emphasize the Gospel of John, because John had the most mystical understanding of Jesus, and the other 3 all had slightly more world-oriented. So they just skip over a lot of it. I think some of it may have been changed to suit certain people's causes, and the rest of it's just too obscure. It's, for me, every time I've been to any ashram and met any other guru or any other teaching, I just thank God for Swami and Master. And I love the Bible, and I love the life of Jesus, and I'm so glad Jesus appeared to Babaji and sent us a new messenger. But when I read the Bible, the power is so palpable. I can understand why people would spend their whole lives reading it and continue to be inspired. I have a great respect for people who are devoted to Jesus. There's a tremendous amount in there, but it's so obscure, some of it. And you have to work so hard. We don't. We just get to take the self-realization parts. All right, why don't we chant? And let's, the part of what we were talking about a little while ago was when we were talking about Ramana Maharshi and the ability to respond to the call at whatever level you're being called, to be living at the front of the force of your own destiny, pushing through whatever is blocking you. And whatever that is, it doesn't matter at all what it is. Whether it's working out a relationship with someone who's close to you, figuring out how to support yourself in life, overcoming a tendency to be unkind, inner anxieties. It doesn't really matter what it is, because for this hour was I born. And you really can't work beyond where you are. So wherever the prow of our inner spirituality is up against the ice, that's where we need to push. And the extreme examples of freedom and greatness give us a way to lift our eyes to the horizon. And that power pulls us forward through whatever ground we're presently walking on. So let's chant, and then we'll meditate for a few minutes and try to really settle in with divine acceptance and bringing Divine Mother into whoever we're trying to be, whoever we're becoming in this moment, and bring the Master's hand into that effort on your part. Your question was?
The Bible does give one example of Jesus suffering on the cross.
Oh, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And the people said, he is calling for Elias. And the Old Testament ends with Elisha, who was Jesus in a form of incarnation, and Elijah, who was the great prophet of the Hebrews, and the prediction that they would be reborn. And that's part of the scriptural justification for Jesus being the true Messiah, is that John that Jesus said that John the Baptist was Elijah, but they knew him not. And that's why Jesus took, and Master just states unequivocally that Jesus and John the Baptist were Elias, which is Elijah, and Elisha, which is Jesus, from the end of the Old Testament. They did, in fact, reincarnate just as they said they would, and that John was Jesus' guru, and that's why Jesus took initiation from John, took baptism from John, even though you throw in this peculiar twist where Elijah had given all his power to Elisha, and so that Elijah, when he reincarnated as John the Baptist, had less spiritual power than his disciple Jesus. And that's why John didn't want to baptize him. But Jesus said, it's in the fitness of things that you should do so, because it is because of you that I am what I am. And therefore, I will always honor you for that. I said to Swami, the story is so confusing already. Why did they have to throw in something like that? That was one of Swami's eloquent shrugging his shoulders and just looking at me, saying some things will have to be saved for later for us to understand them. Regardless, that is how it took place. It's partly, I mean, as I sit here thinking about it, I think Swami didn't want to put his mind to it. But you also have that interesting scene between Sri Yukteswar and Master, where Sri Yukteswar says to Master, if ever I stray from the true path that both of us follow, you must take my head upon your lap and help me to come back. Which is a sort of a strange thing for him to say at that point. I mean, I'm just making this up, but it slightly relates to John the Baptist playing this role with Jesus, where in fact he'd given away all his spiritual power and it had to be given back to him. But I feel there are so many things about guru and disciple that are so hard to understand that it's better to just leave a few mysteries, because I don't really feel we can really grasp this. Over the many years that I lived with Swamiji, some people would find themselves in this huge conundrum about whether Swami was taking Master's place and whether we were looking too much to Swami and we really ought to look more to Master, and Master was the one, and why was Swami acting in a certain way? And my response always was, I can only work with what I know. And what I can see is that Swami has a tremendous amount to teach us. And if at the point of final liberation he does a little handoff to Master, that works for me. I don't really know, because I really don't know what any of this actually means. And I was going to expand from that because, of course, we are here at Easter. I didn't finish about Elias. So the people heard Jesus cry for his guru, is what they heard, really, because he was calling for Elias, where are you? Master, Master, where are you? But he called the name Elias, that's what some of them heard. And when I asked Swamiji, this is so contradictory to everything else we teach about how a master transcends the pain, where does this come from? The answer Swami gave was from the life of Rajasi, where he said, and Swami wouldn't have known this firsthand, well, maybe he did, that apparently at the very last in Rajasi's life, there was a moment when the light that he was always accustomed to seeing disappeared. And that just for a moment he was in darkness. And then he must have, I believe this was an incident before he died that he then spoke about. That's the only thing I can figure out. And when I think I asked someone about it, that's how they explained it. That everything went dark. And then there was a little tiny pinpoint of light, and then he stared into that light, and the light came back. And Swami actually said something to the effect that that happens. That there can be a moment of just at the end where it just, all of a sudden it goes away, and then it comes back. And that is an explanation that I have no way, I haven't the slightest way of either verifying that or attaching that to anything that I can verify. So I just have to hear it, because otherwise it's completely bewildering in the life of Christ, given everything. that that would happen, but there it is, it did happen. That he would call for his guru is fascinating, just fascinating in the whole picture, and extremely touching, that the relationship would always be there. Maybe it was for that reason alone. Maybe it was part of the Leela, so that he would call for his master to prove the prophecy, to show the way of a disciple. I'm guessing, but sometimes it's interesting to speculate. The other part of it, which is highly related to that, is just the whole idea that Jesus did die for our sins. And Saranya was talking during the break about some of her friends who are very focused on the very fundamentalist explanations of how much Jesus suffered for him and how much we love him in gratitude for doing that. And actually, there's more truth in that than we might first see. Even with the idea that Jesus didn't suffer in the way that people thought he suffered, he did suffer also. I mean, it happened to him. He felt the pull of the flesh. He was able to transcend it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. And that's a sort of a subtle distinction, but it's a fact. Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. We say that every week, and we're really describing this extraordinarily incomprehensible reality of these masters who are born for no karma of their own, but feel the call of their disciples, or feel the call of potential disciples, and out of compassion are drawn into that. And everything about their incarnation is a sacrifice for us, every part of it. And Master also says, advanced souls can literally take on the karma of their disciples, so that the disciples don't have to work it out, that they can simply be spared. They have a certain karmic inevitable destiny, and the Master just comes in and he absorbs all that. Instead of that energy being rooted to the individual, he just sweeps it over and directs it toward himself. And Masters work it out on their bodies. Master himself worked it out on his body. He had very bad knees. Ananda Ma used to just be unpredictably ill and then well, and then sometimes ill and sometimes well. Swami's health condition made no sense at all from a medical point of view, just none. And he would also become sick and well, and you just could never tell. I mean, my own belief, which he did not deny, is that he was also working out a great deal of karma on his body. The tapasya of Ananda was on his hips. What does that mean? Yeah, I mean, and so Jesus did. That sacrifice it was exactly what people say it was. That he took a tremendous amount of negative karma and just ran it through his body. And among the other reasons, you see, why even if he suffered, he didn't suffer. So to say he didn't suffer is not the same as saying that the pain didn't happen. But if just think of a mother and her child. If you were able literally to take from your child a certain amount of suffering and it made your body hurt, would you mind? Your body would hurt, but you would do it gladly. How many mothers have sat by the bedside of a sick child and prayed to be able to take the sickness, and would willingly have done it, even if they had to struggle to endure it. It's easier for a master to transcend, but that doesn't mean he didn't feel it. So he did die for the sins, which is another word of karma. Now Master modifies it in this respect. The crucifixion itself was only for those who were there. That doesn't mean that Jesus can't continue to take on our karma, but there's no physical body for him to work it through, but the Master can still, the energy has to go somewhere, but he can absorb and transmute the energy. There's no physical body to do it, so he does it in other ways. What are those ways? I don't know. But he did, really. He accepted limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of his people. And in the Last Supper, which I mentioned at 10 o'clock and haven't mentioned since, at the Last Supper, Jesus said, I've taken you as far as I can take you. I'm paraphrasing. And after I am gone, the Comforter will come and teach you. The Holy Spirit will come and teach you what I have not been able to teach you so far. And Master explains that after he was crucified, he took so much of his disciples' karma that they were more advanced afterwards. And so there's the day of Pentecost, in which the Holy Spirit descended on all of them, the apostles. And they became enlightened in the Spirit in a way they hadn't been before. The Holy Spirit, the Comforter, the Om vibration. These are all the same meanings. But that wasn't possible until Jesus burned out all their karma through the crucifixion. And so he knew he was going to do it. And he told them at the Last the Last Supper, I'm going to do something. I'm going away from you. But don't worry, because it'll be all right. I'm going to send this one. And I can't tell you, you're not able to understand more, but you'll be able to understand more later. Isn't that fascinating? And isn't that just, oh my gosh, think about that. And even as he was being crucified, well, first of all, he prayed for those who had crucified him, because even though they had done a very naughty deed, they were right there with him. They were in his vibration, and he was able to pray for their salvation. And there's wonderful, I don't know how true they are, but there's a wonderful novel about, it's called The Robe. It's a fabulous just piece of biblical fiction about one of the men who was actually there, who was a centurion who crucified Jesus. And then everything that happened to him after that, until he eventually became a believer. It's a great story. I recently read it. It's just a great story. And but also there were two thieves being crucified at the same time as him. And one of them recognized Jesus and asked Jesus. He knew who he was with, and he asked Jesus to intercede for him and to save him. And the other man was mocking Jesus. And the one who recognized him spoke to his fellow thief. And he said, mind your tongue. How can you be doing this? This man is entirely innocent. We're guilty. We're being punished for our actual sins, but this man had no sin. And then the thief says, pray for me. And Jesus says, I will see you today in paradise. So whoever that soul was, who had obviously lived a life that wasn't exemplary, he still, in that moment, had the spiritual sensitivity to recognize Jesus. And because of that receptivity, Jesus was able to take his karma and take him all the way. It is the greatest story ever told. It's an amazing story, all the different aspects of it. And so it behooves us, in our own way, to really believe that Jesus did die for our sins, and to feel, Swami has elevated that with what he says in the festival. But every time we read that, it's helping us to remember to be grateful. And gratitude is, of course, one of the most noble and refined of attitudes to have, and to not take for granted. And, Christians carry this perhaps, certain kinds of Christians carry this to a certain extreme of just, constantly emphasizing how much Jesus suffered for our sake and so on. And I suppose they get inspiration from that, but they're not wrong. Because these masters, they have no reason to come. They have no reason to take on all the aggravation of human life, except out of love for us. And then, of course, the next line in the festival, here then is the fourth and last stage of the soul's long journey, which you have to recognize are right next to each other. The here then is the fourth and last stage, the redemption. To those who offer up their little light into the infinite light, the grace of God comes sooner or later. We all have to live in that same degree of selfless willingness to serve the spiritual well-being of others, to offer our little light into the infinite light of God. Period. I am the way, the truth, and the light. You have to walk where I have walked. This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Walk where he walked. So I think that's the end of the story. One moment of silence and then a closing prayer.